if you're not convinced that this is a challenge, I thought I'd just throw in a few thoughts before bringing in Iona and Anand to talk for about 10-15 minutes each about their own work, and then just throw it wide open. Airwars did a study with young diplomats at American University in Washington, D.C. last year, where we analysed mainstream US media coverage of civilian harm in Iraq. And we found that for the first 2 years of the war against ISIS in Iraq, there wasn't a single US mainstream media news report from the ground on a specific civilian harm event. Nothing. There wasn't one. So for the first 2 years of war, there was no ground reporting. Even so, when the Pentagon comes to determining civilian harm and saying whether civilian harm happens, one of the biggest single determinants of whether they decide that harm has taken place is whether a US MSM correspondent has been on the ground. We found with Mosul, for example, the Battle of Mosul, that the bulk of the cases that the US-led coalition admitted for that battle, in which it seems at least 12,000 people died overall as a result of fighting from all parties, the biggest single determinant of that declaration of harm was whether the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, or the Wall Street Journal had been there and had interviewed witnesses. So the role of the field correspondent is crucial, not just in telling the stories, but actually framing our understanding of civilian harm. And if those MSM reporters aren't there, what does that mean for our understanding of civilian harm? If we look at that same conflict, the war against so-called Islamic State, Iraqis and Syrians themselves have self-reported more than 26,000 deaths from coalition actions dating from 2014. So those communities on the ground, self-reporting out, primarily through social media, local media reports, more than 26,000 fatalities. That's what they're telling us. And a similar number of fatalities reported out from Russian actions in Syria alone. There's almost 50,000 deaths of civilians being reported out by local communities. So why aren't we listening to those voices? And I can say confidently that we're not, that those numbers aren't ones that you'll hear discussed widely. And then finally, the question of remote analysis, which is having an increasing effect on our understanding of conflict. One interesting example, there was a mosque bombed in Syria in March 2017, which killed up to 62 civilians. That attack was initially assumed to be Russian. It was in Idlib, an area where the local Al-Qaeda affiliate was active. There was no reason initially to believe that it had been anyone other than the Russians. In fact, it was a New York-based reporter who uncovered the US's role in that attack, in fact, the in-house Airwars reporter, and it was primarily remote analysis by Bellingcat, Forensic Architecture, and Human Rights Watch that definitively showed that in fact it hadn't been an Al-Qaeda gathering, as the Americans later claimed, but in fact a mosque where a significant number of civilians were killed, both at the mosque, and then as those civilians attempted to flee, they were subsequently attacked again and more killed. So there were no reporters on the ground, and yet that has been one of the most powerful stories around civilian harm that's come out of Syria in recent years, where for all sorts of reasons, getting reporters in on the ground has proved particularly challenging in ISIS-held areas, not least because ISIS has murdered journalists whenever it's been able to find them. So in this world we live in, where there's this general absence of reporters on the ground in conflicts, these remote wars our governments fight, and yet with so much information online, how do we ensure that the effects of those wars are properly understood? And what are the risks of these new methods?